Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is our second lecture for week 2. So we're going to talk about lecture 3. Last time we talked about how we end up with the body parts that we end up with. This time we're going to talk about how we end up with what's going on in our minds, at least to the best of our ability to determine that. So we're going to start, though, with cultural regulation of gender expression, and I'll explain why in a little bit, so hold on. So last time, you may remember, we talked about how you end up with your body parts. So fetal sexual development in terms of your biologic sex. So here's a quick review to freshen it up in your mind. So typical XY people have a Y chromosome. So on that Y chromosome, they have an SRY gene, which turns the gonads into testes. Once they become testes or testicles, they start making two hormones. The first is MIS, and MIS causes the Müllerian ducts to shrivel up and go away so that you don't end up with a uterus and fallopian tubes. And then the other hormone is testosterone, and testosterone is going to do two things. It's going to tell the Wolffian ducts to persist and become the internal structures of the male reproductive system. And it's also going to tell the external genitalia to masculinize. That genital tubercle and part of the genital folds are going to become the penis. The labioscrotal swelling is going to become the scrotum. In a typical XX person, however, there's no Y chromosome, and typically there is no SRY gene. And so what happens then is that the gonads wait around for a while. In the absence of a signal to do otherwise, they turn into ovaries. Now, the ovaries get busy making ova, eggs, called oogonia when they're very immature, and oocytes when they're a little bit more mature, but they're not really making any hormones. And so really the story of typical female development is the story of absence of those two hormones we talked about for the male. So without MIS, the Müllerian ducts stay and they become the uterus, the fallopian tubes, and the upper portion of the vagina. Without testosterone, Wolffian ducts degenerate. They can't live without it. And also without testosterone, so in the absence of the signal to do otherwise, the external genitalia will feminize. That genital tubercle is going to become the clitoris, the genital folds will become the labia minora, and the labioscrotal swelling will become the labia majora. So we talked about typical development, and then we talked about some differences in development, which we call intersex conditions, because they have some characteristics that we traditionally associate with male and some that we traditionally associate with female biologic development. So you might remember the individual who has XX chromosomes, but an extra SRY gene. So they end up having testes that make those normal testicular hormones, MIS and testosterone. So they develop like a typical male. The only difference here is that they don't have the other genes that are on the Y chromosome. And those would be the genes for making sperm, spermatogenesis, as well as the ones that code for being a little bit taller and having slightly bigger hands, feet, and teeth. So those are the only ways they are different from a typical XY male. We also talked about people who are XY chromosomes but have no testosterone receptor, therefore they can't see the testosterone. And so they have testes that are making testosterone, right? They're also making MIS, so the Müllerian ducts go away. They're making testosterone but can't see it, so the Wolffian ducts go away. So they end up with no internal reproductive structures except for those testicles, those testes. Externally, again, they can't see the testosterone, so they develop typical female external genitalia. We also talked about congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So these are XX individuals whose adrenal glands, which is a different part of the body, makes extra testosterone, usually later in fetal development. And so they'll typically be kind of female gendered on the inside in terms of their body parts, but their external genitalia might be somewhere kind of in between stereotypical male or female, sometimes called ambiguous genitalia. So those are some examples, just a few examples of the many differences that can actually occur in biologic sex. So a couple of things in the news. I think it's really interesting for intersex people. We've kind of culturally and as a society kind of pretended that they don't exist. And we often traditionally have performed surgeries on any intersex infants to try to make them as normal as possible. Unfortunately, some of those surgeries cause scarring and problems with function and are really not medically necessary, right? They're more kind of seen as culturally or socially necessary to have parts that look like other people's parts. And so there's a big movement to say, like, we shouldn't be operating on these babies, right? Because why don't we just let them grow up and then they can decide for themselves? Right. So that's a really interesting and encouraging phenomenon, right? To not do unnecessary genital surgeries on children. And the other thing that I think is really fascinating is that although the reality is there are people who are truly, physically, biologically not 100% male and not 100% female, they're in this in-between intersex place. We have not, and still do not in many regions of this country, have a way to officially recognize that in the gender on your birth certificate or your driver's license or anything else, right? So even right now in Wisconsin, if an intersex child is born, they have to pick either male or female for the birth certificate. Either one is wrong, right? The answer is that they are intersex, and we don't have that option yet. Hopefully we will someday soon. Okay. So if we kind of remember our big spreadsheet of all these different overlapping terminologies, right? So of sexuality, sex, and gender, we can see that last time we talked about how we end up with our biologic sex or biologic gender in terms of our body parts and all those things. What we're going to focus on in lecture 3 are the more psychological aspects, right? So your gender identity, your internal sense of self, and your sexual orientation, which is just a little subset of your sexuality. Before we get into those, though, actually, we're going to spend some time talking about gender expression. So here we go. So we're specifically going to talk about cultural regulation of gender expression because it's really important in understanding how gender identity and sexual orientation have kind of been framed and viewed in our culture, and what biases and preconceived ideas or feelings we might have about that kind of going into the conversation. So, when a baby is born, and if I say, oh my gosh, my best friend just had a baby, your first thing might be like, oh, you have friends who are young enough to have a baby. But anyway, right, usually the first thing we say is, what is it? Well, the answer to that question should be, it's a human, right? But we want to know right away, is this a boy or a girl? As we talked about in class, like, it seems to be so foundational to our understanding of who a person is, right? We need to know their gender. We need to be able to kind of put them in that male or female box, that boy or girl box. And then we start kind of extrapolating from there about who we think they are, or who we think they might come to be. So it's no surprise to you that we live in a very strictly gender binary society, meaning there's boys and there's girls, or there's men and there's women, and we have very rigid ideas about what that means, and we don't have a ton of in-between space. Now, certainly there are other places in the world that are more strictly binary than we are, and there are places that are a lot less strictly binary than we are, kind of in our American culture here. So, as we talked about, everything from what toys you're given, what colors you wear, what kind of styles of clothing you wear, how you style your hair, do you wear jewelry or makeup, your posture, your manner of speaking, right? So many things. And then we also have kind of these official designations, right? So your identifying documents, your birth certificate, your driver's license, you're constantly filling this out on medical forms. It determines which bathrooms you use, who you can live with in the dorms. And then it has all these impacts on, what hobbies are you encouraged to pursue? What sports are you allowed to play, right? So we have all these ways in which society has rules about what is okay for girls and what is okay for boys. So I want you to appreciate that this runs really deep. This starts right from the get-go, often before you are even born, right? This kind of indoctrination and acculturation to what is expected for somebody with a vulva versus somebody with a penis, which is really what it comes down to at the moment that you're born. And this kind of continues throughout our whole lives. So I'll tell you a story from when my son was 2.5. We went to Target to get him his first tricycle. We were really excited. And we went to the little toy section near the bikes, and they had 2 different tricycles at Target. One was pink and purple, and it had these glittery streamers. It was really pretty. It was something like this, although not quite. Actually, I think it was prettier than this one. So, and that one was down on the floor. There was also a red, blue, and yellow one, which was like hung up on a rack. And so we wanted to see, gosh, is he big enough to fit this tricycle? So we said, Gavin, why don't you go ahead and get on this tricycle, the pink and purple one? Try it out, see if it fits you, and if it does, then you can pick which color you want, because we're trying to be open, right? So our 2.5-year-old gets on the pink and purple bicycle, and he's wearing some stereotypically masculine little boy clothes, and he has a short haircut. And there's a 3-year-old girl in the aisle just down from us, and as he gets on the bike, she loses it. Get off that bike. You can't ride that bike. That's a girl's bike. Mommy, make him get off the bike. He's a boy. He can't ride that bike. I mean, she was losing it, right? And so what was so powerful about that experience for me is to realize so early, right? She's only 3 years old, and she has very, very strong ideas already about what's okay for a girl versus a boy. So we need to acknowledge that we've been very strongly socialized to accept that certain things are only for girls and certain things are only for boys. So we need to acknowledge that and remember that as we continue our discussion. Okay, so before we move on from talking about toys, I just thought this was cute, wanted to share it. How to tell if a toy is for boys or girls, a guide in the blue bubble. Do you operate the toy with your genitalia? No. It is for either boys or girls. Yes, this toy is not for children. Right? So anybody can play with anything provided it's age appropriate. Okay, moving on. So we have this strict gender regulation in our society. We've all been steeped in it. We're surrounded by it constantly. Certainly some families will kind of be more strict and enforce these ideas more than others that might be more open to not following those typical gender norms. And so whenever we have something like this, we always have to say to ourselves, what are the potential benefits of this system, right? Of having ways to signify through our clothing and other things, whether we are male or female bodied, and or of having certain activities that are restricted, either formally or informally, to certain members of the biologic sexes. Because anytime we see something that is really widespread in a culture or really common around the world or really pervasive, it's often because it is providing some type of benefits to that society. And so we'll kind of talk about this a couple times throughout the course. So this is serving some function in society, right? It might be a worthwhile function. It might not be a worthwhile function, but it's serving a function because we keep doing it. So it's interesting to kind of think about what are the potential benefits of this system that we have. And hopefully we had time to talk about it in class. So in general, when you think about culture, right? So cultural norms and things that we've kind of created that these are the ways in which we should behave, at their best, right, they can create this feeling of belonging and identity, right? Think about a girls' night, you're all getting together, you're like, oh, we're women, we like all have these same things in common. And certainly female-bodied people do have certain things in common. And women-identified people do have certain things in common, often related to their experiences out in the world, right? So it can really create this feeling of belonging, identity. It can also be a way to kind of communicate your identity to the group, right, at large, to say, I am a woman, right? Or, I don't know, I am a Packers fan, right? To communicate, right? It's kind of useful to have ways in terms of your appearance or dress or other signifiers to kind of tell people what group it is that you belong to. And these kind of cultural norms can also help people to feel a kinship with each other despite their differences, right? They can sometimes be a unifying influence, right? So John McCain's quote here, we're Americans first, Americans last, Americans always, right? Let us argue our differences, but remember, we're not enemies but comrades in a war against a real enemy, right? So sometimes these cultural norms, when they're at their best, they can really foster the sense of community and collaboration, working together, pride. They can be very positive things. Of course, they can also be kind of negative things. And so, pause the video here and think for a second, what are the potential harms associated with any cultural norm like this and kind of prescribed and expected sets of behaviors, right? So in a general sense, right, when they're at their worst, these cultural norms can kind of ostracize or push away people who don't seem to fit in with what you're expecting, right? There's this intense pressure to be what you're supposed to be, whether that's really who you are or not, right? And it can make you feel like you're no good or you're worthless. It can lead to social isolation. And we are very social creatures. And when we feel like we don't have a place, when we don't have a sense of belonging, that can contribute to suicidality and other types of mental health problems, addiction, and so forth, right? So cultural norms can be harmful sometimes in that way. They can also limit your potential, right? So as we've talked about, women-identified people are much less likely to pursue STEM careers, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that that we could spend an entire semester talking about, right? And men are less likely to enter certain other careers, especially ones that we see as kind of more nurturing types of roles. So it can limit the choices we make in our lives, right, in terms of what we do or don't do, what career we pursue, but it can also limit our own psychological development and well-being, right? So in terms of gender ways, these are just a couple of examples. There are many more, right? But a lot of women get the message that the most important for them is to be sexy or attractive or desirable. And so they will devote lots of time, attention, and resources to trying to be sexy, attractive, and desirable, right? Perhaps to the detriment of other things that they might rather be doing or could better utilize their time doing. And also that they need to be subservient to men. So that is still a message that is being received by a lot of people. And that's not healthy, right? And on the male side, right, a lot of male identified people are told, man up, suck it up. You can't express your emotions. You have to be strong. You have to be aggressive. And this is a concept called toxic masculinity, which again, we could talk about for a whole semester, right? But it really can get in the way of people being fully human and fully themselves. And of course, these cultural norms can foster discrimination and harassment, everything from on the job to in the schoolyard, to on the streets, right? It can enable a lot of unkind, unsafe, violent, unfair behavior that is unjust. So the cool thing about culture, so we just talked about some of the potential benefits and some of the harms. But the really neat thing about culture is we're constantly creating and recreating it, right? By the stories we choose to tell, by the ways we choose to behave, by the words we choose to use, and the things we choose to say. And so the thing about culture is that we can change it. In fact, it is constantly changing, of course. And so I ask you to realize that you have a role to play, right? So all of us are constantly creating and recreating the world we are living in, which means if you want it to be different, you can start creating that own different reality, right? So create the world that you want to live in, which is kind of a neat way to think about things, I think. All right, enough philosophy. All right, so I'll show you this image, right? So this is a child wearing a shirt that says colors don't have genders, and they have pink glasses, and they have some earrings in, and they have short hair, and it's kind of styled. And you might be looking at this person and thinking, oh, that's really cool. And you also might be looking at this person and saying, you know what, I don't know if that's a boy or a girl. And you know what, that makes me feel really uncomfortable. And maybe it even makes me feel so uncomfortable that I feel angry. Okay. So if that's your response, I want you to notice that and acknowledge that, right? If you feel kind of uncomfortable, like, I don't know if it's a boy or a girl, like, oh, right? That's a really common reaction to seeing an individual that is not telling you in their gender expression that they are either male or female. That's actually really common. Because we grew up with these really strict rules, right? And this is so foundational to how we've been taught to think about people, as whether they're girls or boys. And so anytime somebody doesn't conform to those stereotypical ideas and doesn't give us that information in a way that we're expecting, so that would be called gender nonconformity, it tends to make us feel really uncomfortable. And so I just want you to spend some time acknowledging that it can make you feel really uncomfortable. And the reason why it does is because of how you have been socialized. It's because of what you are used to seeing, what you're used to, what you're familiar with, and what is different and weird and strange from compared to what you're familiar with, right? I'll never forget when I had some colleagues many years ago from Russia, actually, over to eat, and we just needed to have a quick sandwich for lunch, and I got out the peanut butter and jelly. I love peanut butter and jelly. I grew up on peanut butter and jelly. I am a huge peanut butter and jelly fan. They were disgusted. They couldn't believe that anybody would like peanut butter, first of all, and then to put it with jelly, they thought was just like the most horrible thing ever, right? So some things may seem really unpalatable to us, but it's because it's something we're not used to, right? It's not because there's something inherently wrong with it. And so that's the message that I want you to kind of remember. So this is Jacob Tobiah. And Jacob Tobiah, the first time I found images of this person, I found profoundly uncomfortable for me, right? So I work with a lot of different people in a lot of different settings, and I think what I found most uncomfortable for me about Jacob is that this is someone who is choosing some very feminine modes of gender expression, right? The flowers, the hair, the lipstick, the eye makeup, the nail polish, but yet has beard stubble, which is a profoundly masculine type of gender signal. And so what I found is that for me, although I could be comfortable with somebody who is male-bodied with female gender expression, I actually had some difficulty when people started mixing very high femme with very like butch or very masculine things together, because it was just so confusing. And that experience is one that a lot of my colleagues have shared is some of the most challenging, right? So it's a little bit easier to get around a very binary gender presentation or gender expression, even if it doesn't kind of go with or fit with the biologic sex that you would expect. But sometimes when people kind of mix genders together, that can be especially challenging. So I really appreciate Jacob, and that Jacob has been really forthcoming, and there's a media assignment where you get to watch a video of Jacob, and then you see like this is just a marvelous person who just loves gender and wants to express it in lots of interesting ways. And like, isn't that cool? Isn't that neat, right? That's really fun. All right. So I'm hammering so much on this discomfort that a lot of people feel with gender nonconformity, because when it comes down to it, a lot of the discomfort that people have around people who are transgender or people who are gay and lesbian actually is because of the gender nonconformity that's inherent in that, right? So when we think about somebody who's transgender, they are not dressing or acting or identifying the way we think they should, right? They are doing these things in a way that is gender nonconforming, right? They're not adhering to those stereotypes. Similarly, with people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual or pansexual, they're not dating or loving the people that we think they should based on their biologic sex. So again, it's kind of another way of being gender nonconforming, and that is where a lot of the discomfort comes from. All right, so As we proceed then, 2 important rules I'm going to ask you to try to adhere to, or things I'm going to ask you to try to remember. The first is that just because something makes you feel uncomfortable, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it, right? It doesn't mean it's wrong, right? Like the idea of my parents having sex is profoundly uncomfortable and icky to me, right? But it's not wrong. Like, hello, I wouldn't be here without it, right? So that's not a really good indicator of whether something's right or wrong. And then the second one is that you don't have to approve of or even understand someone to treat them with dignity and respect, right? So even if you're just like, still, oh, I just don't get it. I just don't get it. It doesn't matter, right? They're still a human being and you can treat them with dignity and respect. All right, I'm getting a little preachy here. So here's our whole big thing, right? And so now we're going to move into gender expression and sexual orientation because we have finished talking about cultural regulation of gender expression. All right, I'll meet you at lecture 3B.